Hey, Revengers and people interested in rebuilding 3000 GT transmissions, particularly the all-wheel drive variant found in the 3000 GT VR4 and the Dodge Stealth RT Turbo all-wheel drive. This transmission is, not that unordinary, other than it is a compact transaxle that has all-wheel drive, front diff, and a center differential. A bunch of components that may be familiar to you if you rebuild front-wheel drive, transverse type platforms, but we get a lot of questions about this, how to set up some of the bearing preloads and how to install a front limited slip differential. Today here, we can see here, Hunter, we have two differentials. Both of these are totally open. Okay, so this is a stock differential and this is a stock differential. If you have a limited slip, which we have some over there, but this particular transmission is not getting a limited slip, so I want to demonstrate the theory of what you would do with this particular transmission. Problem we have here is twofold. For one thing, there's a little bit of wear on these bearings. I would say that if you're rebuilding this at home, that's not an issue at all. But when we're doing a performance rebuild here, we pretty much replace all the bearings, regardless if they kind of need it or not. Just because, last thing you want is somebody to spend a lot of money on a transmission and have, a relatively inexpensive part cause a problem in the future. So we're going to replace the bearings on this, which can actually be a little tricky. You wouldn't think so, because it's pretty, theoretically straightforward, but there's a couple things to watch out for. And we're also changing the actual differential. The 97 and up transmissions had a plastic speedometer gear, and it's not uncommon to see this coming off like that. Once that fails, you're not going to have reliable or any speedometer, because this gear actually turns your speedometer sender. The earlier models had a cast in, forged in, whatever, metal gear here that cannot be removed, but also does not fail. The good news is these front diffs are not that hard to find, because people that upgrade to limited slips usually want to get rid of them. And the other good news is the 5 and 6 speed casting for the actual front differential is exactly the same. This gear is different, so don't get those mixed up, okay? Your gear ratio is not the same on your front diff. There's in fact 3 different ones. There's the 5-speed one, which includes the 18 and 25 spline, 91 through 93. There's the 6-speed one that was sold to the US market called the USDM gears. And then there's the JDM and Euro gears that were utilized the 5-speed rear end, because they ran a 3.545 ratio instead of 3307 in the rear, which meant they also had a different front diff gear here that was in accordance with this pinion gear, which is also known as the front output shaft. That ratio is 7% shorter than the USDM ones, and so you cannot mix any of those situations up. I have seen it possible to install the wrong gear set combinations in these transmissions, and if you run the wrong rear end with the wrong front diff, you can burn your VCU up almost instantly. The drivetrain's going to be all bound up, etc., etc. I have also heard that the 5 and 6s can get interchanged a little bit too, and that causes all sorts of problems with noises, because the helix angle on these is a little bit different because of the difference in the gear ratio and the diameter of the gears and stuff, and so you can't really mix those, and you definitely shouldn't. But the part we need is just this, and so there's some shimming procedures you can do in the manual for these spider gears, but basically you want to find out, does this have excessive backlash, and it really doesn't. So, and you can also look to see if these gears have an eroded part here. You can actually see the gear contact pattern, and it's really good on this gear. So this gear is going to be just fine. We're going to swap this ring gear to here, but the first thing we're going to do is change these bearings. When you set up a limited slip on one of these transmissions, if you use a Quaife limited slip, which we have at revengeperformance.com, you're not going to have to change the shims a lot usually. You're talking a 1/10 or 2/10 of a millimeter, and we will include a couple of shims with your differential purchase. That way you can make some adjustments. We had custom shims made that actually fit perfectly in this transmission. They're made from stainless steel, which you could not previously get anymore because Mitsubishi discontinued them. But if you put, say, an OBX one in, which is an okay differential to use, but the tolerances are not what you're going to have from something made in the UK, Quaife, we found that almost always you have to drastically reduce the front differential shims. So a stock one is probably between the range of 6/10 to 9/10. of shim, and when you go to the OBX, you go down to like 0.2. And that seems like a drastic change, but we're gonna do the solder test here and show you how you can determine that. And we're also gonna do a feel test to show you what it should feel like. We can set them here by feel if we want to, but we always validate things with solder and then do by feel. And so it's important to do both steps of that process, because if you just go by what the solder says, well, say your race got a little bit off when you were putting it in, or your housing bore is a little bit scarred up, it may not compress that solder as much as it should. So if you put it together one more time, you might find that, oh, by hand, this thing's locked up, I can't turn it. So it's always important to verify that you can turn them by hand. It's very easy for all of these on this transmission except the counter shaft, where you have to reach in through the input shaft hole and try to turn in it. All of these shafts you should be able to turn by hand. Okay, counter shaft's pretty difficult. It may hurt your thumb a little bit, try turning that, because it's shimmed from 0.2 to 0.3 millimeter, and it's a very long assembly altogether. There's 3 case sections of the transmission, and so you're going to feel more preload on that one than usual. If you set that counter shaft up as loose as you would say this front output one, then by the time all 3 case sections grow, you may have no preload. And so that's why the factory specified a little bit tighter on that one, and why I encourage not making it so that you can't turn it with your bare hands, but it should be pretty close. We'll show you. But this, pretty much just reach in, turn that. Once we get the mid case on here, no big deal. And you can verify that quite easily. You'll note this transmission also has a bell housing brace for wrench performance here. I'll welded that in. And this will prevent the case from breaking apart under hard launches, because the input shaft and the counter shaft are always trying to push each other apart due to the helix angle on the gears. So, long story short, it's a lot easier to pull these bearings off with this ring gear off. It can be done with it on there, and I've done it. It's not worth the time. Okay, you can weld crap on here. You can use exotic bearing splitters, things like that. At the end of the day, when you do a lot of these, part of the thing is being efficient. And so if we find something that requires extra steps, but the overall amount of time it takes is less, then that's still the way to go. So I encourage you to not be scared. Take this ring gear off, because it's not hard. So particularly if you have an impact wrench, this is pretty easy. And so we're going to take this ring gear off. We're going to clean this up, get the gear oil and stuff off of it, and then we're going to go ahead and put back on this. First, we're going to pull these bearings off. The reason you can't easily get this bearing off is because, as you see, it's quite subset beneath this ring gear section. You try to get your bearing splitter on here. We got this old trusty OTC 952. So we use this bearing splitter pretty much every day, many times a day. If you don't have one of these, you're going to struggle. Do a lot of transmission type tasks. Even if you're doing this once, I think it's worth it to get a bearing splitter. You don't have to get an OTC. You may not need one quite this big. We got one too that's about that freaking big for heavy duty truck stuff. But they may come to where they're 4 to 6 inches. I would encourage you to get the biggest one you can afford. There's not really a disadvantage to going a little bit bigger, but a 4-inch one might do a lot of work on these transmissions without much issue. So you can see here, well, okay, that's not gonna work, right? We're trying to get underneath this cage, and if you're pressing bearings apart to be reused, you shouldn't pull them by the cage, but we're going to today because I don't care about reusing this bearing or this bearing. Any of them we're going to replace. So I'm going to pull them by the cage. Now, as I mentioned earlier, clever fella or lady could knock this cage off and cut it with a Dremel, hit it with a chisel a bunch of times where you want, and try getting underneath the lip of this, and you can build some weld up there with a TIG or a MIG, whatever you want. It takes too long. Okay, if you're doing these transmissions all day, every day like we do, it just takes too long. It's faster to take that ring gear off, and the other opportunity you get is you're building these transmissions, on a kind of commercial industrial scale like we are. Try not to make assumptions. Do you know that these bolts are tight? Hope so, but do you know these bolts are tight?
No.
No. So why would you build this complicated, financially big expense transmission and not know that these bolts are tight? So I want to take these out anyway. and then clean the threads on both of them, apply new Loctite, torque them to 54 foot-pounds. You're done. If you had these in and out 90 times, I'd probably replace the bolts, but they're fine to reuse a couple times. There's no issue. It's not a torque to yield or anything like that, and they are grade 10.9 bolts, so they're pretty stout from the factory.
It's okay.
But it's good to get them out. We'll hit the wire brush on them, take the old Loctite out. The other good thing is, at that point, you can also clean the mating surface between our diff and our ring gear, and just make sure everything looks pretty good on that situation. And if I was trying to save that bearing, I wouldn't beat it around like that either, so watch out. So anyway, once you've got this ring gear off, which I'll demonstrate here in just a sec, not very hard, provided you know where your impact wrench is. Good. Alright, so these, if you got an impact, very easy. It does help to use the correct socket. 14. Doesn't take that much. You take your 17, zip these out. Very easy. Now we want to get this ring gear off. Pretty much just stick it like that. And grab your hot, handy, soft handled club. There we got. Boom. If that don't come off that easy, you probably got another bolt in there still. So this is pretty much going in the scrap pile. You'll notice they did update the part number on here. So if you look at the 5-speed ones, it's 440 because the G-Track 446. It's 446 on the 6s, 97 plus. If you look at an earlier one that does not have that plastic speedometer gear, the part number actually is still 440 on them. And so that's another way you can identify if you got a late model transmission. When they went to this plastic piece, they must have finally ran out of 5-speed diffs and figured out they could save a couple bucks. Do that, but I've heard of many people end up losing their speedometers over it, which is not optimal. So we're gonna clean this gear up, we're gonna clean these bolts up, and we're gonna press these bearings off. So we got a really big press here, but by no means is this necessary. Bearings are rarely super big press fit unless you're working on like Caterpillars or something. But this is where this helps. So you do that, tighten these up a little bit. And again, if a fellow was trying to really, or gal, really trying to save these bearings, I would not recommend reusing them once you've pulled them off by the cage, because if that cage grows from being bent, it can contact the bearing race, or I've seen plenty of times where you're doing this and then all the rollers fall out when you're done. And so you don't want, I mean, when it's in place in the transmission, theoretically your rollers can't fall out, but I still wouldn't like to have the thought of that cage being all bent up. It's causing problems in the future. You're gonna need a pretty big press bed if you want to fit that whole diff in there like that. And you can make all sorts of contraptions with vertical stuff if you want. But since we got a press that's big enough to do this, it's kind of what I do it here. And then we need to press on the middle of this. That's kind of on the side of being too small, but I think that'll be fine. Don't press on the bearing itself, or you're not going to go anywhere. Particularly when you're this close to the press, wear your eye protection. Ear protection wouldn't be a terrible thing. You gotta get these pretty tight. Sometimes these don't want to come out because you're just barely gripping it. So we'll see what kind of luck we have. Might not work the first try, that's okay. It did. See, I come right out. Be prepared for the weight, go slowly. There you go. We position our clever pillow down here in case things get out of hand. Well, you can see here, we got that bearing off. The next one's a little bit easier. just because you can kind of get underneath there better. But that one on the ring gear side is the one that's going to give you trouble if anything does. Do not be tempted to get medieval on it, because you can, you start hitting this with a chisel, that's just not good, so don't. I know my dad was one of those guys too. The guys good enough for the blowtorch can cut those off too, but if you're not confident in that ability, I wouldn't risk it. So we got that, same situation, but like I said, we can get underneath this one a little bit better, so I anticipate less of a drama. Oh, you also want to make sure this pin's not falling out. That's your front pin. They don't come out a lot on the Getrags. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen one come completely out, but make sure that's not loose, or you may want to consider some repairs or replacement of your differential. So we'll tighten this baby up. Straight back and press the table. When you're pressing, always keep your hard parts, bridging any gaps. Turn it like that, you're bending your bolts. That's just a fact. Use one a hair bigger. Yep, coming out, that's fine. That'll happen occasionally. Try to get underneath there a little bit better. I don't usually take a wrench, these adjustment bolts. Sometimes you gotta. See if we get it this time or not. I mean, I've taken off 200 of these, probably. 175 times out of that, easy. Sometimes not. But for the most part, it's easy. And if you're not confident, honestly, if you want, we'll pre-install bearings on these diffs for you. You buy a limited slip from us. Installation's much simpler. Like a lot of things. There we go. There we go. That's that. So I'm gonna let Hunter take over here for a minute. He's gonna clean up those. Okay, Hunter cleaned this up. He cleaned up the ring gear. It's quite important that you do so. And he's got all our bolts cleaned up. So what we're gonna do is go ahead and put the ring gear in. We have a really large vise for this. I'm sure there's other concoctions you can think of, but this also has soft jaws, so you don't have to worry about hurting the diff really. And if you have a limited slip, it may be round, so just kind of tighten it up enough to, not spin in there, but not distort the case. That's a bad thing. So, got our bolts all clean up, the old Loctite, and any grease or anything. It is important, the direction you install this. Yes, you can put it on like that. It will not fit in the transmission right. You'll find out when you go to put the bell housing on. This is the correct way. You can kind of see because of the socket witness marks on there. And this may be tight if you're using a limited slip or aftermarket diff, and just sort of tap it down, make sure your bolts line up. I usually put a couple bolts in, and you can snug them up, but if they take a lot of effort, something's wrong. You need to check it. So we're just gonna put a little bit of Loctite 242 on here. Yeah, you could use red, but I've never found it to be necessary. The factory was pretty much blue strength. Alright, so we're going to put these in, a little dab of Loctite on each one. That in there. See here, we're starting nicely. Stick them all in there. We're going to tighten these and a little bit of a cross pattern. It's not absolutely critical once you get a couple of them in, but it's still a good idea. And we're going to tighten these to 56 or 54, somewhere in that neighborhood. And we'll be good to go on this. Put the bearings in. So, We're just going to snug these down with our impact, not tighten them too much. Okay. Okay. Grab our torque wrench. And you can take a marker and do these up as you torque them if you want to be sure. And we typically do that in case there are multiple people working on the same unit. So that, kind of going across pattern. And now I'm basically just going to go straight around to be sure I don't miss any. And with anything like this, it's not a terrible idea. And just go around twice, okay? Well, it takes a little time, but if these bolts come loose, you're gonna blow up your transmission. And if any of them feel soft, for some reason, replace the bolts. Haven't really run into that on these. They're good bolts, but if they don't torque up perfectly, replace the bolts. Okay. So now, we basically need to put the bearings on. I'm just going to clean this off. Make sure that that's good. Go here. Something there. Got our bearings. Our two different bearings. I can get these for you. Or if you just read the numbers off the old ones, they're not that hard to acquire. Try to use decent bearings. We try to get, you know, best brands we can. National, SK, Timken sort of thing. It's two different sizes. See, that's too small. Put the bigger one there. You could obviously use a bearing driver and just tap it. But we have our press inches away, and I do find it just goes on a little bit easier when you do it with the press because you're assured that it's going on 100% straight. We'll have to adjust our bed height here. Okay. Got that and that and that. That and that and that. And we got that. And that. And I have, we use these all the time. They came from some type of ball joint kit, but it's a bunch of sleeves. They fit perfectly, various diameters. Do not press on this, okay? You're just pressing on the inner core of the bearing. You hear that noise change, you know it's done. You'll see this is actually below this piece. So you can safely set that down like that. It's not actually contacting the bearing. If you ever run into a bearing that's not like that, then you're going to want to put another sleeve on the other side so you're not pressing force against the bearing. Like that. Got that. And we got this littler one. Go there. So of course we're going to need a smaller sleeve, that, and some of these we've tweaked on the lathe. Watch your fingers. Shouldn't take a lot of effort once you get those set up. Okay, so this unit is ready. We have an assembled front diff, good cast on speedometer sensor. But now we can't just throw that in there. We need to set the preload on this unit. Okay, so we have our mid housing and our bell housing, the two components you need. You're gonna want to clean the bearing races out really good. Do that here. And bigger race goes on that side. Doesn't hurt anything oil these races a little bit, okay? They're gonna go in the case a lot easier and not damage the dang thing. You get a bang race tool. You can get these Harbor Freight, whatever. Doesn't have to be anything amazing. Just don't beat steel on steel when you're putting a bearing in. Okay, it's in. If you're wailing on that, it's probably crooked. Fix it. Don't keep beating. Okay, so now the tricky part. This is where the shimming is done inside the bell housing side here. You want to make sure that this is clean of any debris here. So that slides easily. And we're going to be putting our bearing in there. But first, we're going to be putting some solder in there. So this is pretty ordinary stuff. I try to get the higher lead content. Doesn't matter that much though. Put a little assembly lube on them, grease, whatever you got. Cut a little piece here, it's supposed to be about 10 millimeter. The thicker you make that, the harder this is going to be to press, and so the worse that this is going to work. I think this is something like 63 thousandths, but basically, it might be 100. I'll have to measure it. Let's see what this is. It needs to be thick enough that it gets mashed, basically. So if you switch over to inch, which I usually work in metric on these, but let's go to inch for this measurement. Yeah, we got about 60 thousandths. That's kind of what you need. It's just kind of the thicker solder that you can get in any electrical plumbing section supply thing. Doesn't have to be any particular composition. The higher lead will squish a little bit easier. So we got our two pieces here. It's pretty critical that you make sure those don't fall out during this process next. We're gonna be putting this race in here, just like that. And we grab our tool again. You can't just wail on this, because if you smash that solder while you're putting this in, it kind of defeats the point, doesn't it? It's basically knock her down. I'm gonna knock it flush, but there's still a gap. You can see down here, there's a gap. We have not mashed the solder, and so that's pretty critical to that. I like going flush on that because it ensures that the race is flat. Because if it's a little crooked and you go to put this together, maybe the diff doesn't do a great job mashing the solder. So we're gonna grab the diff. At this point, it's not really critical that you lubricate the bearings, but on final assembly, you're gonna want to. So we'll stick this in first, pinch it probably. Flip this unit on here. And we're gonna toss some bolts in. On this transmission, they're 35 millimeter long. We always use new bolts, but we have a whole bunch of bolts here that we kind of use for testing, things like that. So that by the time you get the transmission, you don't have to worry about the bolts being scarred up, stuff like that. It's not necessarily critical that you torque these, okay? If it makes you more comfortable, feel free to torque them up. I think it's 18 foot-pounds, what we do. But provided you put them in kind of tight, you don't go overboard and break anything, it's gonna be fine. But like I said, I've done a lot, and so I know kind of what they need. If you haven't, then feel free to break out your little torque wrench, take them to 18. And same note here. Sometimes I don't do every single bolt because it's just not completely critical. But if you're not sure like what bolts would really be needed, you know, go ahead and do them all, and that's fine too. Particularly, you need to make sure you got like a bolt on each side, like the unit here, or you could have this whole thing crooked and not get a real good mash on your solder. You'll know you got a good mash in your solder when both of them are pretty close to each other. If they're like a tenth off, that'll happen sometimes. I wouldn't worry about that. Just kind of average it. The specification is within a tenth of 2 anyway, and so it's not super ultra tight. But you want to get as even as you can. There's also a bolt that comes up from the bottom of the bell housing on these 6 speeds in the clutch area. I'm not gonna worry about that right now. So we want to snug them down, but evenly. Because once again, we're trying to get even smash. So if we tighten one bolt down all at once, you could have it crooked in there. And once you kind of got them all snugged, come back, tighten them. I know this impact wrench works pretty well by now, so I know that's pretty close to spec. Okay, now we should have solder mashed. And so we can come in here now, and you should be able to move this pretty easily, because basically you got no preload right now, maybe very little from the solder having to get mashed. So that'll kind of give you a feeling that when you do put shims in here, if you go from this to like locked up, that's a problem. This is actually a little bit snugger than they usually are. So I might go just a little bit over the solder width, solder thickness. It may have not pushed the race down quite as far as usual. The solder thing, yeah, it's scientific, but there's variables that are sometimes hard to control. And so that's why we do the hand checks, and why you can't rely on it like it's the holy gospel. You know, you gotta use your brain too. That's why, you know, a lot of people aren't comfortable rebuilding transmissions, because it takes some intuition. But we're gonna take this apart, and then we're gonna check the solder. And normally on a front diff, you would add 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters of preload. Given the way this feels right now, I'm gonna add 0.1 and kind of start with there. And if I find it's still too loose, there's no harm in taking it back apart and putting another 0.1 in there. If you go way too tight, the very first off, you can ding the bearings, which is not great. But most likely if you go too tight, it's just gonna be locked up. The difference between completely locked up, you need a tool to rotate it, and completely loose is only like 3/10. It's not a lot, 3/10 of a millimeter. It's not, which I think is like 6/1000 of an inch, 7/1000 of an inch, something like that. So it's not a huge scale, but there is about 1 to 2/10 of range that's good. And so we go for, I usually only go 1/10 over what the solder says, because of the reasons it may not be matched as much as you think. Because if you go into the manual and it's like, hey, this is your counter shaft, you can do 0.1 to 0.3 millimeter of preload. If you added 0.3 millimeter to the counter shaft solder, I mean, your engine is going to be drugged down trying to turn that. It's a lot tight. I don't run that tight. I usually just run about 1/10 over. Sometimes even on the counter shaft, since it's kind of so hard, the case flexing and everything, for it to want to match that solder, I actually only run the solder value. And so again, that's just something that we developed over here by feel and experience, opening up brand new units. We've had some 6-speeds that literally factory new, and we've compared the way they rotate and taken some measurements. And so now we use the solder to get us in the ballpark and kind of tweak it a little bit as our feel kind of provides. But as long as you have some common sense about this, you know, you can go by the solder and kind of start from there. It's faster than just guessing at shims. If you have your original shims and you're not replacing anything, then that's a good place to start, and add or subtract a 1/10 maybe. Usually add a little bit, because I think the case stretches a little bit over the decades. But when you go to these limited slips, particularly the OBX, it's way too much. Like, I've seen them come in here where they did not shim them at all, and they are so locked up, I don't know how the car moved. So it's critical you don't just throw these parts in. This is a step, your first time, maybe it takes you a couple hours, but you know, you're putting thousands of dollars of parts in these transmissions. Last thing you want to do is have premature wear on that bearing. The reason a bearing preload has to exist is because when there's no preload, or you have end play on a tapered roller bearing, the rollers will actually slide along the race instead of rolling, and quickly develop flat spots, and that's not good at all. Plus your shafts are going to get misaligned. And so like the gear that drives that front output shaft we looked at earlier, this actually drives that by sitting in here, right? Inside that well in here. If your bearing preload is gone, then guess what? This gear is not going to rotate on axis like it's supposed to. Your tooth mesh between here and there is not going to be optimal, and that can make some noise and wear your gears out too. Additionally, some other minor consequence is your axle seals can start leaking, because your actual diff's moving around like that, K-wampus in there. Just a lot of things can go wrong if you don't get this set up. But if it's too tight, then the bearings overheat, and you know, obviously there's parasitic losses trying to drive the unit then too if it's extremely tight. But the main thing is the bearings are going to overheat and they'll start to delaminate and fall apart and everything else. I've seen them look like a waffle. I mean, like just gone. So it's important that you get that right, but also don't be like terrified of it. Okay, basically this wouldn't even be that bad. I'm probably gonna run this a little bit tighter than that, but it doesn't have to be like we're launching a space shuttle here. It just needs to be good, really good. We try our best. We set every single one of these things up to spec, every bearing tolerance, because I find a lot of them are wrong based on previous rebuilds or just carelessness at the factory. I mean, I've seen units came in, particularly the end case input shaft bearing, they're like never right. They're always too loose. And then that whole bearing spins in your end case, tears that out, makes noises, all kinds of problems. So what we'll do now is hop off my soapbox. Pop this little guy up here. Take our diff out. Kind of put your thumb in there like that. If you come here, you can see, guess what? That bearing is no longer even with there. So we obviously moved it. Okay, that's good. If this was still even with there, something's gone. So these can be kind of a challenge to get out if you don't have the correct tools. This is a tool meant for some type of GM transmission for pulling out bearing races, which we've been using for years. We've gone through a whole bunch of them, breaking teeth off of them, but they work pretty dang good. You basically got these legs, and you got your bolt here. If you don't have this, it's a little bit of a struggle, I'll be honest with you. There's a couple of special tools it takes to make this job easier. Are they needed? Not really. You can flip this thing over, heat that area up with a propane torch, tap on it with a hammer, and a lot of times that bearing will start to fall out. Then you can kind of get a punch in there from the bottom and tap it the rest of the way out. But these little tools save us a lot of time and wear on components. Wrong wrench here. And that's one of our kind of our credos here, is do no harm, you know. So I don't want to, you should be able to work on a transmission, you know, a lot. Like you all be able to rebuild a transmission 10 times, the same transmission, and have not permanent damage to it, you know. And so if you're like beating races out or prying them out and stuff like that, nicking up the case every single time you do it, I don't want to do things that way. Because we want these to always never have anything that's worse than when it got here. And so that's kind of why we accumulate some tools to make this job easy. As we pull on this, you'll see that the race came out, no problem. Got a race here, and we got our two solder chunks. Look down in there. You see those things flattened like a banana over a steamroller. That's good. If they are smashed completely paper thin, like you're doing an OBX diff, be wary of the results. Maybe use thinner solder. So when they're paper thin, they might measure out to 1/10 or 2, but whatever that is, I would take 1/10 off at least and kind of start from there. It's just like a range that they can be accurate in. So you might just grab some thinner solder. You don't need a crazy caliper to do this. We just got a pretty decent one here, but anything will work really. And you want to make sure you're not grabbing like an edge that's not mashed, but it looks like this one was pretty even. 0.77, that's totally in the realm of what I'm used to seeing here. And then this one is 0.78. That's pretty much textbook results. When those are both the same, that's just more confidence that it's correct. So we're probably going to be looking for around 0.9 shim. Because again, we're looking for preload. Okay, we're squishing the bearings. That solder tells us what the shims would theoretically be if we had 0 end play and 0 preload. So you're trying to add to that. So whatever the solder is, you add the specification. So if the spec was 0.1 on the preload, you'd add 0.1. If it was 0.3 on the preload, you'd add 0.3. Again, within realm of possibilities here, I tend to stay on the lower side because the solder lies sometimes. It doesn't always get mashed as much as you think it should. So let's see what we got. So these are the shims that came out of this transmission. Once you've kind of cleaned them up, there's no reason that you can't use them again. The new replacing the shims is not, you know, a benefit, but we need to check the thickness on these. So we got 0.45 and 0.45. So if you measure these together, it can work, but often you're going to get a little higher result. So I tend to measure them independently. So guess what? We got about 0.9 here, which matches perfectly with what our solder was asking for. So I'm going to clean these. Again, if you got an OBX diff, it's probably going to be like 0.2 by the time you're done. We send 2/10 with the units that you buy. We have these shims we made, and so just don't put the original shims back in and think it's going to be correct. It won't. All right, so we put our shims back in here, and then we're going to go ahead and put our race in there. And again, I kind of lubricate the outside of the race just to make it slide in easier, not damage the case. It's not going to spin in there, don't worry. Freeze the inside of it, so new bearing, be pleased. And then we'll do the same thing. And we get that one over here. Go ahead and stick this in there. And now, not that I'm saying whale on the transmission, but you don't have to be so cognizant of mashing the solder. So it's already not there, you know. Don't leave the solder in. In case that wasn't clear. You'll have incredible amounts of preload. Okay, so that's good. And we got this oily. We're going to do a test here by hand to verify preload is correct. But the solder and the math says it is. We'll just see. So we're going to go ahead and clean off the factory manufacturing lubricant off that bearing and put a little bit of this assembly gel on there. You can use motor oil, transmission fluid, gear oil, probably Vaseline. It really isn't important. As long as it's not dry. Don't assemble these dry. Stick this on there. Once again, put that there. If you ever want to kind of feel what 0 preload feels like, woo, that's 0. If your stuff's like that, you have no preload. That's not a way to run it. So we're going to go ahead and tighten these down. And once again, we don't need to worry so much about doing them in a star pattern, although that's advisable anyway. It's not going to affect any kind of solder we're mashing anymore. Gotta throw a few things on the floor, or it's not a real video. This isn't like an art piece here. Okay. Now we're gonna make sure we at least stick a number of bolts in here, because these cases flex a lot. It's just cast aluminum, which I know you may consider cast aluminum doesn't flex much, but it does. Now it'll break if you flex it too far. Don't get me wrong, it does flex. That's why it's kind of important to put the majority or all these bolts in when you're checking this. Particularly these sneaky devils. Do that. Okay, that should give us some reasonable information. I'm gonna stick my finger in here. Look at that. That's good. That's actually perfect. So look at that. It takes effort, but it doesn't hurt. Like, because my fingers start bleeding, I don't need a pry bar to do it. That's exactly what you want for the bulk of these things. Now we know when this transmission heats up, it's still going to have preload on it, but it's not going to be so hard for that diff to turn that it causes that bearing to wear out prematurely or causes undue heat in the transmission. So really, solder didn't lie this time. The front diffs, these front output shafts, the center diff, all three of those are typically pretty easy. The solder's correct. Okay, it's just when you do that counter shaft, I don't know if it's because all three cases just like to flex instead of moving that race in there. It can cause some issues with solder not getting mashed enough. If you really want to be clever, you can make some setup bearings. Just get an identical countershaft bearing and then sand some off the outside of it to where it's a slip fit or close to a slip fit. I don't do that just because we got the right tools to take these bearing races out. It's not a problem. Got enough experience to know when the solder's lying. But if that scares you, you can create a setup bearing too. So there's always a lot of different ways to do things. I don't contend that our way is the only or the perfect way to do it, but I know it works. I know we've done a lot. This will apply to pretty much anything you work on that has a case that bolts together and holds a tapered roller bearing. You always want to get the specs if you can, but for the most part, if it feels like that, you know, you're at least in the realm that it's not going to explode, you know, it's going to live. Probably exotic stuff, maybe they run a lot more preload. I haven't worked on a lot of that stuff, but try to get a manual, figure out what you need to. But for these Getrag 6-speed, 5-speed, 3000 GT VR4, or Dodge Stealth RT Turbo all-wheel drive transmissions, this is the right way to do it. We have all the parts you need to rebuild these. I've never been one to hide parts from people, and I've never been one to hide knowledge from people. Somebody taught us this, okay? So I'm not gonna act like, you know, I came up with this out of nothingness and shouldn't share it with people. We want you to rebuild your own stuff. I cannot, Hunter and I, and the other people working here cannot rebuild every 3000 GT transmission on the planet. If you're somewhere too where it costs thousands of dollars to ship them to us, might not make sense. But we want these cars to stay on the road. You know, whether you're getting parts from us, rebuild services from us, or you're just watching our videos to figure out how it works. You know, I don't care. Hunter doesn't care. We're not competitive with our own customers. Okay, I just want your stuff to work. If we can help you, we absolutely will. I feel like we have competitive prices on services and all the parts that you need to do these items. We also know what parts work. Okay, there's some parts out there that are made in questionable factories and stuff like that do not work. And all the parts we have are absolutely proven. We do, I don't know, many dozens of transmissions a year just for this platform. I know what works. We have customers running in the low tens. They send their transmission back a couple years later for refresh and it still looks good. And so we know what works. I run these parts. When I had a manual on my car, I ran these parts. I run an auto now, but I also still developing parts for that too. Brent and Hunter, they're gonna be running manuals. We're gonna keep developing these parts. We're having gears made. You need second gears to these transmissions? We're making them. We're getting them made. Haven't told everybody this yet, but they're made by PPG Australia. And they make some of the top racing transmissions in the world. We did not want to go with just any factory that said they can make gears. We wanted somebody proven. They can build gears that can survive actual competition rally conditions. Believe me, they can make a gear that'll survive on the street. These second gears are going to be dimensionally identical to OEM. So there'll be a drop-in. We have 5 speeds, second gears being made. We have 6-speed reverses made. They're going to be here any day now. We sell them on adventureperformance.com. If you buy them before they arrive, there's actually $150 off right now. So if you need some gears, get them while you can. We only had like 20 made because it's tremendously expensive to get done. So there's a good possibility if you don't get some now and you need some, it could be next year before we have them again. The gear shop is telling us if we order now, it's probably going to be like June or July before the batch is done. And so with that and shipping from Australia, you know, you're looking at a whole nother year probably if you don't get them now. And we're not going to sell all the ones we have because we need some for some of these units. So I would just get in if you need some gears. We have synchronizers, good synchronizers, carbon synchronizers. We have OEM synchronizers, original sintered brass ones if you want those. We have high quality seals that don't leak and actually fit the shafts like they're supposed to. You know, you get your seals at a normal parts store and they give you seals for the front wheel drive transmission. It doesn't fit. We got the right stuff. I mean, we're affordable. Like I said, we have a seal kit for these transmissions for like $55, and it's got both axle seals, the little end case cap you need that most people don't have, and your output shaft seal too, and your shift shaft seal if you want that for your 6-speed. So we got all that. Happy to support this platform. We're gonna keep doing it, and I hope that this video is educational. I hope this encourages people to buy some differentials they might have been scared to install. If not, then at least just kind of know this will apply to any of the bearing races in this transmission. The strategy is the same. This was just kind of one of the easier ones to demonstrate, but for this center diff, it's the same thing. You got this bearing, it's got the shims in it, and then you have this end case that goes on there, and you check it the same way. And you can leave the bell housing off, and so you can just reach in, try rotating your output shaft like this. Unless you have the worst VCU on earth, this will rotate that. I do note if you have a towards and center differential like we sell, it may not rotate that because there's not enough preload internally when there's no traction at all. But for a stock VCU type situation, this will rotate this whole thing, and it should feel basically like that.
Revenge Performance is the place to get the parts and the advice to help right the wrongs on your vehicle. We partner with the industry leaders in parts distribution and warehousing to get you the best possible prices, the widest selection of parts, and the fastest shipping. With our real-time inventory on our website, if we say we have it in stock, it's ready to ship. From us or from our many national distribution partners. With hundreds of thousands of parts available, I guarantee we can get revenge on your ride.